Welcome back, everybody. It's been a very nice lunch. I hope you've enjoyed it. And now the boring bit, I'm coming to speak. It's my pleasure, and indeed my privilege, to introduce you to our guest speaker today, Chris Dolan. He'll give the address to the memory of Robert Louis Stevenson. Chris's name popped up at an RLS event I attended last year, and my ears immediately pricked up. My first connection with Chris and his wider family began in Glasgow over 30 years ago. In fact, over 50 years ago. And since then, despite the passage of time, I've kept aware of his career, really, because he's a playwright, he's a poet, a novelist, and I've enjoyed following his progress in the media in his various interesting works, many of which include Robert Louis Stevenson. He is one of the earliest recipients of the Robert Louis Stevenson Memorial Award, and that was way back in 1999. And when I approached him earlier this year to invite him to a luncheon, he accepted that invitation with enthusiasm, which was a great relief to me. And it was only after further conversation together that I began to get a full insight of how engaged he has been with the works of Stevenson in both his plays and broadcasts that many of you, I'm sure, have heard. And I know, in fact, one of these, Jack Shedden, has played a part in the broadcast. He's also admitted that one of his favourite stories is that of Kidnapped, and Martin here is hoping to establish a Kidnapped trail to folks to follow here, and I'm sure there'll be an interesting link there between the two of them. I'm therefore very much looking forward to hearing him speak today. Chris is fluent in Spanish, but I'm pleased that today he has agreed to give us the address in our native tongue.
Buenas tardes. Ya vamos a hablar de Robert Louis Stevenson. Thank you very much, John. As I'm about to tell you, actually, you're more of a connection with my Stevenson and professional life than you may realise. I became a professional writer, gave up the other jobs I did about 30 odd years ago. And one of the first events I ever attended with other writers, and I was really pressed to be amongst these writers. I can't remember exactly who all was there, but certainly Liz Lochhead, Alan Spence, Brian McCabe. There's about 7 of us. And somebody from the audience asked, how did you become a writer? What was it that made you become a writer? And I'm so pleased to be here today because I know exactly why. And the reason is quite precisely and specifically Kidnapped. But at this event, when they were asked, I was the last being the least important writer of this group of writers. They went through them all, and Liz started and said, how did you begin writing? And she said, well, I was a sick kid, and so I spent a lot of time in my house reading books. And I thought, damn, that's what I was going to say. And the next person got up, Alan Spence or Brian or whoever, and said exactly the same thing. All 7 of us have been to one degree or another sick kids. So we spent a lot of time reading books, and probably spent a lot of time taking up Dr. Cosser's time in the surgeries. So, that's how I originally got into writing and reading and loving that whole idea. And I remember I come from a large family. Doctor, it's funny, I find it still quite difficult to call you John because you're always Dr. Cosser. I knew all my family, but I came after, there were 7 of us, I came after 3 girls. So I read everything that came into the house. Quite often it was girls' groups and Mallory Tower books and things like that. But I read all the Secret Sevens, the Famous Fives, all those books. Because I was a sick kid, a sister was really always sent to the library to pick up a new book or whatever, and they were bringing back books for me. And I remember really well, I'd be about 10, I would say, and somebody bringing back, one of my sisters, Maggie, I think, bringing back Treasure Island. Now, up until that point, I had been the Famous Five and Biggles, and maybe C.S. Lewis and stuff like that. I mean, C.S. Lewis is probably a bit of a stepping stone onwards, but Treasure Island I remember so well, I couldn't read it. It was too hard. I just found it very, very difficult to read. I also found it very, very, very frightening. I remember being terrified in the first couple of chapters of Treasure Island. I still am. It's a scary book. And I couldn't read it, but there was something about it that kind of fascinated me. And I don't know whether I asked for or just so happened that I gave up on it. And some months later, Kidnapped arrived. And that changed my life. It honestly changed my life. Everything about Kidnapped. And the minute I began reading it, everything about it just spoke to me. It seemed to speak my life, about what I hoped, what you could possibly do in life, how exciting life could be, how difficult life could be. It spoke to me about Scotland. It spoke to me on many different levels. So it was fascinating such a lovely thing that 50 odd years, 60 years later, I managed, after years of pleading with BBC, to adapt Kidnapped. I finally got a chance to do it about 5-6 years ago. I did manage to become a writer eventually, and I mainly did theatre and books, but very quickly I became a radio writer. And I thought I might talk a little bit about radio. I thought there's no point in me talking to you about Robert Louis Stevenson, because every single one of you here, I'm looking at Martin and Oakins, who know 10 times more about Stevenson than I'll ever know. I've spent my life as a professional making stuff up, not knowing anything, or you know stuff very briefly as you write the one piece you're writing and you forget all about it. So I thought I'm not going to talk too much about Stevenson himself, apart from my experience and specifically my experience of Kidnapped. But I thought I could talk to you a little bit about radio drama. And I thought I was in completely safe ground here. I thought nobody in this room is going to know anything about how you make a radio drama. And then John Shedden turns up. So he knows every bit as much more than I do about a radio drama. But I've never written about 30 odd dramas, and it so turned out that I became a kind of a specialist in adaptations. I've done many of my own original radio dramas, but I love doing adaptations. And one of the first I was ever given was The Master of Ballantrae, which is a book I'd read, but not one that particularly stuck with me. When I came to adapt it, I realised just how much of a masterpiece Master of Ballantrae is. But generally speaking, radio is a wonderful medium for books. And people who love radio drama tend to be people who love books. Okay, a little example of how I kind of understood how radio worked. The very first drama I ever wrote for BBC Radio Scotland, or for Radio 4, because all the plays you hear in Radio 4 that are Scottish in one sense or another are produced here, the actors and directors and writers in Scotland, but the Radio 4 productions. The first one I ever did was my own play, a theatre play, which I had on called Sabina, and it was made into, I wrote the adaptation. And I remember being so excited about having a radio adaptation with young kids at the time. And we invited around some, my wife might remember this, we invited around some friends and families. It's fantastic, got this radio play on. And when you're a member of the cast and crew of it, you get a CD about a week or two before it goes out. So I had a CD. Do you remember CDs? Mm-hmm. They were just after vinyl. And I remember inviting people around and putting it on. Have you ever tried listening to a radio drama in company? I mean, it's almost impossible to do. I mean, where do you look? It's a really difficult thing. You can't listen to radio drama publicly. That's a great realization for me. It is one-to-one. So although there might be 1 million listeners and the Radio 4 dramas you can get, I did a number of rebuses in Edinburgh. Police have done those of Ian Rankin's rebuses, and at times we hear up to 1 million listeners. But there are 1 million individual listeners, because you don't, unlike any other form of drama, normally we go to theatre of one sort or another, even television we tend to watch as a family or a couple or whatever. Radio drama is very solitary and it's very, very close to reading. And I think it's one of the reasons why I love it, and it's one of the reasons why it does adaptation so well. So one of the early adaptation I got was Master of Ballantrae. Stevenson has been good to me all my life. He gave me Kidnapped, he kind of changed my life. It took 30 years for that to happen, but I can trace it back to Kidnapped. And he's been good to me in the prize, the Robert Louis Stevenson prize, and just simply as a reader I've loved everything. But the Master of Ballantrae was a great learning process for me. And it's so strange. I had no idea that John Shepard Jack was going to be here today. The only name from any of the dramas I've done that I've actually written down here is the character of Ephraim McKellar. Because I learned so much from writing that. I always loved the character. If you remember the Master of Ballantrae, it is McKellar who writes his version. And how much do we trust his version? But that idea of a narrator in radio speaking directly to you, and I remember being incredibly powerful, and one of the reasons I remember being incredibly powerful was how it was acted. This incredibly strong, steady, completely reliable voice, except you're thinking, is that exactly what happened? Or is that the way that the family would like it to happen? And it was an early understanding of how writing for actors, and I tell my students this now, and I do for other teaching, if you don't like actors, if you don't see the genius of acting, don't do this job. Because that's what you're doing. You're providing a springboard from which directors and actors and others can springboard from. And I think the Master of Ballantrae for me was extraordinarily important. And also in how a story is told and a Stevensonian story is told. Yeah? So if you remember, the Master decides to fight not with King George, but with the rebels. So you set up this duality. Think of everything that Stevenson has ever written. And that duality in the middle of everything. So you have Henry against the Master throughout the entire thing. And who's good? Who's bad? Whose version do you understand? Whose version do you accept? Yeah. So that I think was a learning stone for me for what I was going to go on to do afterwards. And Kidnapped, I think, is one of the most enjoyable things I've ever done. It was about the 25th adaptation that I'd done, so I think I kind of knew what I was doing at that point. And it was, in a way, kind of the culmination of learning my craft. Just a little thing on how radio is made. Obviously, Jack, you know, but I think my idea of radio was that actors went in from old films, I suppose, with those old round microphones with BBC written on them. And I assumed that I would write the script, and people went in and they held the script with that, and there were sound effects. If it was a battle, you'd hear the swords be struck, and the actor would go, aha, I have killed you, now you must die. Oh my goodness, you have killed me, I must die. And it's not like that at all. What amazed me about radio drama was it is actually acted. They actually do the sword fencing, they do the running. If we're running up and down stairs, they have stairs in the studio, people run up and down the stairs. And they do everything actively. And as a writer, it's wonderful. It takes about 5 to 6 days to record a normal 2-part series, a classic series for Radio 4. And it's like being in theatre for the entire week. You just sit back and watch these wonderful actors, and you get great actors for radio, because it only takes a week. They don't have to learn the scripts. So although they're sword fighting, they still may well have the scripts in their hands. Though more often than not, you'll agree, Jack, that an awful lot of the really good actors, and most actors, did learn their lines, or learn the key lines, the ones they had to learn, that they knew they were going to be sword fencing, they were going to be running, or they were going to be doing something they couldn't hold the script. They had memorised the lines. But you don't have to memorise every part. So you get people who are terrific actors to come and do radio plays. And I've worked with some fantastic actors throughout radio, much more so than in theatre or television or film, because you get great names. But they don't stand and read out. It is all actually acted. Although the sound man, the spot man, is also a kind of a genius. The things they make happen with sounds. I remember at one point doing a a piece called The House of Mercy, just set in the 19th century, and we needed a jail to be opened, cell door. And there were about 100 online cell doors being opened. And none of them sounded like a cell door. But the spotman, what we now call the Dolby, executive or whatever, in BBC Scotland for a long time was a woman, Fiona, for years was a spotwoman at BBC. And she didn't accept any of these sounds as being the right sound for opening a cell door in the 19th century. So she got an old can of soup and a fork and held it up to the microphone and went, and it sounded exactly like a cell door being opened in the 19th century. They can create all these wonderful things that are just bits and pieces. One of my favourites is, I didn't write it, but Star Trek. You know those doors that open and shut? It's before you got sliding doors. There weren't sliding doors, there was guys behind them pulling ropes to make those open and close again. But the sound, they worked for ages in sound, and the sound you're actually hearing to this day when you hear the Star Trek Enterprise doors opening and closing is a piece of paper you slid out of an envelope and slid back in again. And that's what you're hearing. Radio's wonderful. It's just absolutely wonderful. In The Master of Ballantrae, I'll come on to talk in just a second about how movement is so important in radio. In The Master of Ballantrae, when the Master goes James goes to America, there's a scene where I wanted to have, and I remember writing it, a tribe of 400 Native American Indians come ululating over a mountaintop. You imagine asking a television or film director to do that, and they say, whoa, budget, there's no way. Radio, they press a button. They can do it, they find a way of doing it. I find radio, to this day, probably one of the most satisfying things I've done as a writer. There's something extraordinarily exciting about talking to one person directly into their ears. But you can do anything. You can be anywhere. It's got the freedom of a book where you are talking to one person and you and he or she go off on this journey, and it could be to anywhere. And oddly, you haven't to mention it earlier, Jack, but one of the favourite things that I've ever written in my life was James's third death scene, when he is dying underneath the ground. You are actually, as the audience, under the ground, suffocating with it. And radio has that power to take you to a place and really make you experience what was happening. So, Stevenson's a gift to radio. It's an absolute gift because he's a writer from the last century but one, yet everything that he is writing has an interpretation and a way of working in our century which I think works fantastically well. It's a bromance, yeah. So we all kind of understand that. It's about a friendship between two guys. It's a road movie. It's an adventure thriller. It's a crime. It's a true crime. They happen murder trials. It's got everything you could possibly want. It's an extraordinarily meaty, powerful, big Western story that you can imagine John Wayne or somebody in. Interestingly, there's a version of The Master of Ballantrae, was it? With Kidnapped, with Michael Caine, which I haven't seen. So it's got space for those really big characters, I think, and all the Stevensons, I think, have this. But I think that Kidnapped in particular has just got a certain appeal which seems to me to work in theatre. I've seen theatre versions that work really well, television versions, film versions. It just works. And part of this is about that incredible journey across Scotland. 2 or 3 journeys across Scotland. David gets shipwrecked and finally, teams up with Alan, and they cross back through Scotland again. It's a huge kind of, it's an exploration of Scotland, which again, a lot of people think, does that work in radio? Because it's very visual, it's very physical. Yeah, it works perfectly because you can see it in your head. As long as we create that feeling of movement, and get the sounds of waterfalls or wind or nighttime or armies chasing, all those sounds are around, and it's in the acting to make it feel really there and real. put on, and because of the original writing by Robert Louis Stevenson is so powerful and so vigorous and meaty, it comes across wonderfully. And it's a problem when you try to adapt someone like Robert Louis Stevenson. It's a problem. I mean, a lot of them I've adapted Balzac, I've adapted Dickens, I've adapted Umberto Eco, Garcia Marquez, all these great writers. But if it's a writer who you really, really, really personally love, as I do Stevenson, that's a big ask to be trying to take Stevenson's book and put it in an entirely different medium. And one of the things that you have to do as a writer is take the original process and rip it up. So basically know your source material inside out. So Kidnapped, as with every other book, I read it 4 or 5 times, over and over and over again. I marked it. I go through several copies of the book, buy more books and mark up different bits. I then do the terrible thing about actually rip it up, literally rip it up. Because radio drama and radio drama in general actually works in a different way than the novel. So quite often where Stevenson would have an event in page 45, I'd have it at the beginning. And the very last scene I would have it 3 scenes before that. So you actually take Stevenson and you move him around. Which seems like a terrible thing to do. But I think as long as you have this idea that Stevenson himself is looking over his shoulder at you, and I always have this impression that he's there, and if you do something he's not going to like, he's going to let you know. So I think that's how it's done. The final thing I'd like to say about what I thought Kidnapped was so wonderful for, and I think it's somebody so specifically Scottish, and that is, he does it in all his books, Jekyll and Hyde most famously, but the whole idea of Caledonian anti-censorship, the whole idea of, as a nation, we are endlessly dueling amongst ourselves, endless oppositions. So, beloved by Hugh McDermott and so many other writers, but that idea that there's a nation, there's a group of people, but we have such fundamental differences. And you think about David and Alan, yeah? You've got East versus West, you've got North versus South, island versus mainland, country versus city, Gaelic versus Scots. So many of them, between David and Alan Rex Stewart, there's a kind of a synthesis is made of antithesis, which is what antithesis, I suppose, is. It's Jacobite, it's Whigs against Jacobites, it's Catholic against Protestant, it's the older man against the younger man, it's the present against the past, it's the future, the different ideas of the future. And is it, to some extent, good against bad? And who in Stevenson's always good and who's always bad? Neither. There's a bit of badness about David, there's a bit of badness about Alan, but they're kind of both good in their own ways. So for that reason alone, I think that what Stevenson does generally in all his books is does this wonderful epic view of what it is just to be human, because we're all, at the end of the day, kind of contradictions within ourselves. And I think Stevenson does that so well. I know everybody says Jekyll and Hyde and has Treasure Island and Herbert Mulligan, his last book. Weird Herbertson, as these great masterpieces. I honestly think Kidnapped deserves its place there because it works as a boys, as a kids novel, but it also works as a deep, deep study into the human character, specifically the Scottish character, but I think into the human character. And it does it with such amazing humour and fun and a virility and a vigour, which I think is quite extraordinary and very unusual in a lot of books. And that whole idea, which I mean he's taken from Confessions from Hobbes, Confessions of a Justified Sinner, but it goes right through the whole of Scottish literature, I think, from Alistair Gray to Louise Welch to Brian McCabe to James Robertson, Fanatic, and all those books. So I think that Kidnapped changed my life, and I still would defend it as being one of the greatest books ever written. Maybe it's a personal thing, but I genuinely believe if it's been a while since you've read it, read it again. It is unput down. It's also really funny. It's a really funny book. Alan Brecht's hilarious. And the arguments that he and David have are kind of wonderful. So for me, every time I read it, and every time I'm asked to do anything with it, it's an absolute utter joy. And as John said earlier on, I also won the David Dolan Stevenson award, so he's been very good to me all my life, Stevenson. So for that alone, I think it's worth a toast. And just before I do, I was interested, you made the same mistake as I thought I was going to, where you almost did. I always knew it was Robert Louis Stevenson. I've been corrected so often by people who know better. So I'm going to raise a toast to Robert Louis Stevenson. To the memory of him. Thank you.
Coincidence, guess who agreed to give the vote of thanks today before we move the connection? Our own Jack Shedden. Jack.
Thank you. Well, we've all enjoyed a magnificent luncheon, I think. And I would just like to thank the caterers, the venue itself. What a magnificent view. It couldn't be better. So thank you for what's been a magnificent lunch. And our chairman, I would like to thank John Costa for conducting the proceedings so smoothly and so brilliantly. Well done, John. Thank you so much. The grace by Robert Harney, and of course the caterers and everybody who was responsible for doing things. But principally, what a joy it was to hear Chris Dolan going through his long career, which started as mine did indeed on radio, and it was magnificent. I remember when I first started in radio, having won a BBC competition with 12 entrants, and I was the one who was voted first, which was great. I remember an old Scottish actor, Jimmy Gibson, saying to me, and I'm a young novice in the studio, and he says, where are you off to now, Jack, or John as he would call me? And I said, I'm going to the Beeb. He says, oh yes, it's BB, guess the third letter. And I remember it was Jimmy who brought me up on a thing. I had to say nothing at all, Nathan at all. And Jimmy says, no, it's not Nathan. Nathan was a prophet. It's nothing at all. And I've remembered that ever since. And he was one of the many actors that you learn from. But to hear Chris's talking about Kidnapped and Master of Ballantrae, I played Ephraim McKellar, and I've been in Kidnapped in about 4 different versions, and it was a joy to hear all those magnificent things that brought it all back. I can remember the studio where we played in Master of Ballantrae, and it was one of the last things, the recording in 2005, that Tom Fleming played it. And Tom was magnificent. He had to do a scene where, on radio, of course, he was talking about the 400 people appearing over the horizon. No problem on radio. And Tom had to play with a stick. And he had a long scene where he had to retreat. And so you just heard that magnificent voice of Thomas, but you also heard, in conjunction with the way that he was walking, you heard, I'll see you later, as he disappeared over the horizon. So it was a joy to hear those lovely words, especially about Kidnapped and Master Ballantrae, and it was a wonderful speech. Thank you very much. So would you thank everybody for their wonderful contributions this afternoon. A splendid lunch. Thank you so much.
Nothing at all. Nothing at all.
Well done. Well done. I like that.
wonder who the Shields diagnosed. I wonder who the Shields are diagnosed. How often did you pass? How often did you pass? Chris. Yeah, absolutely.